All right, guys, so this is a lecture on Unit 3. This lecture focuses on key concept 3.1. So College Board states are the key concept states that a deepening and widening of networks of human interaction within and across regions contributed to cultural, technological, and biological diffusion within and between various societies. So the subconcepts, or the concepts that would probably be tested or would be obviously, essay questions or multiple choice responses state that improved transportation technologies and commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade and expanded the geographical range of existing and newly active trade networks. It goes on to say, or the College Board states, existing trade routes, including the Silk Roads, the Mediterranean Sea, and Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean basin, flourished and promoted the growth of powerful new trading cities. So obviously, it's important to be able to compare and contrast those trade networks. The Silk Roads, the Trans-Saharan trade system, and obviously Indian Ocean trade system. Remember, we did write an essay about that. So definitely be familiar with the details of those regions, and also, how those trade networks either changed or stayed the same over the cross or across, not only Unit 2 and Unit 3, but even Unit 4. All right, so what are some examples of those trading cities? Timbuktu, if you recall, was the major city in Mali, right? This is always a common image. The largest mosque that was not a stone structure. Obviously, it's representative of the spread of Islam. Constantinople, right, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and later the Ottoman Empire. Baghdad, which was located in the old Persian Empire, would later become the capital of the Abbasid Empire, the Islamic Empire, and then Chang'an, right, which is one of the large cities in China. And all these cities have something in common. They're markets. They're going to obviously be where the centralized government is established. One interesting piece as far as Baghdad goes, the Silk Roads actually, limited the wealth and the significance as a trading city because the Silk Roads were further north of Baghdad. So a lot of these Middle Eastern trading cities like Cairo kind of lost some importance during this time, but they were still relatively vibrant and urban. All right, so the next subset or subconcept would be communication and exchange networks developed in the Americas. So you want to be able to identify some of these exchange networks in Mesoamerica, connecting the Inca Empire. And the one that you really want to remember would be the Inca Roads or Carpanon, right? So obviously it's similar to the Silk Road in a sense, only this is going to connect those empires or city-states in the Americas. This united the empire like any road would. It also helped the Spanish conquer the Incas, so it had kind of a negative effect long term. The Inca government used the Mita labor system, which is important to remember. It's mandatory public service. You weren't drafted into the military; you were drafted into the workforce, and this workforce was used to build roads. And we'll talk a little bit about the Mita system down the road. All right, the next subconcept is the growth of interregional trade in luxury goods was encouraged by significant innovation in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies, including the caravanserai, use of the compass, astrolabe, and larger ship designs in sea travel, and most importantly, new forms of credit and monetization. So what you want to be able to articulate or write about or understand would be the new technologies that allowed for improved trade, and also new monetary concepts, right? So you want to elaborate on those things. Also be able to explain or identify what those luxury goods were that were coming out of Asia especially. All right, so some examples would be the Chinese compass, the Chinese rudder, the junk ship with lateen sails. And remember, these are technologies that are going to spread into the Middle East and are going to be adapted to or adopted by Middle East travelers and even European travelers down the road. The Muslim astrolabe would be used by Chinese explorers, European explorers, and another important piece would be the understanding of monsoon winds and the understanding of tides. That's definitely important, especially in the Indian Ocean. It's a very, very intense ocean. Lots of storms, lots of wind. Some of the largest waves are going to be found in that region off of the coast of Africa, especially. So it definitely helps sailors to understand the science of sailing. All right, so new forms of credit, definitely, an important piece, right? So the Chinese, remember during the Tang Dynasty, they initiate the idea of credit. So early banking systems, not early, but more modern banking systems emerge in China, where banks are going to loan out money or cash. And that cash can be exchanged for, currency, for example. The abacus was also used for accounting purposes. So, the modern banking system is going to emerge in China, the Tang Dynasty, and that's going to, facilitate trade, especially in terms of loaning funds to explorers, at least on the European end. European bankers and are going to loan funds, but that's an important new concept, right? Flying cash. Not currency. Even the Persians had a unified currency, but this is about cash, paper money. All right, next sub-concept. Commercial growth was facilitated by state practices. That means how the government helped spur or facilitate trade, including the Inca Road, the trading organizations like the Hanseatic League, and state-sponsored commercial infrastructures, including the Grand Canal. So what that means is explain how the government, what role the government played in growing trade and commerce through spending, right? Building things. So some examples would be the Hanseatic League. It's an alliance of Northwestern European nations coming together, kind of like a NATO, right? You've heard of NATO. Kind of an alliance, a national or a nation alliance, where these countries would come together to establish trading rules or guidelines, which would eventually actually lead to trade monopolies. Working together to protect commercial ships from pirates. So the Hanseatic League, again, another great example of what's developing, right? Again, I think it's very similar to what you would see today with NAFTA. We'll talk about NAFTA down the road. It's a North American Trade Agreement or Association. Again, I think NATO was more about checking the Russians in the Cold War, but it's still an alliance that did benefit those members economically. All right, so the Grand Canal was built during the Sui dynasty, right? That was used, it was funded by tribute or tax. These taxes also built roads and set up messenger services in China, or at least during the Tang. The Song dynasty established the equal field system, if you recall, right? Tried to, taking land from noble or landowners, giving it to the peasants, which did lead to, a lot of tensions between the noble and peasant class. Up here you have the tribute, right? Here's a picture of, these are the Xanadu nomads, right? Providing tribute to, I believe, a Song ruler. So the tributary system obviously is going to not only benefit those infrastructure projects, but also stimulate trade between empires and regions. The Midas system, which we mentioned earlier, again, the Inca government, basically drafts men to, build the road system. And also, this is important, the Inca government would have farmers turn food and clothing over to a local ruler, kind of like, social security or, kind of early, socialized government system where, right, we all contribute to the community or the common, the common good, right? And the government facilitates that. So that's a good one to remember. The Inca, I'm not sure if there's a term for it, but basically, forcing farmers to contribute to the good of society, storing crops. All right, so the next sub-concept, the expansion of empires, including China, the Byzantines, the Caliphates, and the Mongols, facilitated Afro-Eurasian trade and communication as new peoples were drawn into their conquerors' economies and trade networks. So you want to be able to kind of summarize not so much the governing structure, but the role these empires played in trade, right? And growing their economies and the economies of those regions. So let's talk about the Song dynasty, very important. We're going to see new innovations, change to farming. better farming through fast ripening rice, the iron plow. This is going to lead to the commercial revolution during the Song dynasty. So, China definitely, that's an important part to the Song dynasty. You're going to see, a growth in wealth. Again, innovations in terms of farming, right? The equal field system is also introduced, even though it kind of happened earlier on, which remember led to the Yellow Turban Rebellion. I believe that was during the Han Dynasty, but it's kind of reintroduced the idea of taking land from the rich and giving it to the poor. They maintained the Silk Roads, which were, remember, uncovered during the Han Dynasty. And they also facilitated the, kind of an industrialization, a change, right? Definitely change, where you're gonna see the smelting or creation of iron, right? Which would be used. The development of iron, which through the idea of smelting would create steel. So you have iron, steel, and then luxury goods like porcelain are going to be manufactured. It's not as profitable or as extensive as agriculture, but it's called the Proto-Industrial Period, and it's happening during the Song Dynasty. And as time goes on, cities like Hangzhou kind of take over for Chang'an, and Hangzhou becomes the largest or most, I guess you could say, most urbanized of the Chinese cities. So urbanization, commercial, revolutions, proto-industrialization, this is all happening during the Song Dynasty. Definitely a change in terms of Chinese economic, characteristics. What about the Byzantine Empire? Remember, Constantinople was pretty much the center of the world when it came to trade. It was not off of the Silk Road, so it really was a key trading destination for Europeans, right? European traders from Italy would go to Constantinople, and that's where they would, pick up those goods coming off of the Silk Roads. Definitely a very important city. The Byzantine Empire would introduce a common currency, gold coins, that unifies the empire, makes trade easier. Silk weaving, right? They're going to be getting the silk from Asia and begin to weave it into textile. And the government definitely had a role in preventing monopolies in terms of the silk industry. So that's another example of the government, facilitating trade, right? Regulations, and that's something that, going forward would be a philosophy that would be questioned. How much should the government regulate an economy? All right, what about the Islamic Empire? Islam was always pro-trade. Remember, Muhammad was a merchant, so trade was a very important piece. Islam did not look down on trade. The Catholic Church did at times, right? They questioned the idea of profit making, but Islam did not, and that's important. Merchants traveled further than armies. That's if you're going to give credit to one group in terms of spreading Islam, you're going to give credit to that merchant group. They're going to be the ones that bring Islam to Southeast Asia, Thailand, or Malaysia or Indonesia. As new areas were incorporated into the Dar al-Islam, remember that just means Islam as a whole, Sharia and Sunni. Sharia law protected trade and commercialism. It accepted, merchants. Sharia law welcomed a haven of exchange and credit. So that's important. Their laws promoted commercialism and trade. Crops like rice, wheat, eggplant, and citrus were very important goods that were coming out of the Middle East, especially wheat, right, going all the way back to Mesopotamia. Year-round cultivation because of improvements in irrigation and also the weather in the Middle East. And as the Islamic Empire became more consolidated under the Abbasid or Umayyad Empire, trade routes were maintained, protected, and that's going to lead to a lot of wealth. The Middle East, that region was very wealthy, and probably less wealth for Europe, and that gave Arab empires an advantage. Definitely, cities like Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus were very wealthy. Yeah, they were outside of the Silk Trade Network, but that necessarily didn't bring a lot of poverty to that region. That's for sure. All right, what about the Mongols? Very important, right? They're not innovating or growing things or making things. They're transferring things by protecting and maintaining those Silk Roads. And they're going to protect Indian and Chinese traders. They're going to, be the middleman to European traders. They're going to, again, make the Silk Roads, maybe the Silk Roads were a little long, but they sure were safer than the Indian Ocean trade, that's for sure. As time goes on, yeah, the Indian Ocean trade improved in terms of, um, you know, uh, ease or safety, but the Silk Roads were always the safest bet. Again, please remember, though, that southern cities in Arabia were left out of it a bit. But again, they were not, falling into disarray, that's for sure. They just maybe were losing influence to cities like Constantinople. All right, so the next subconcepts are the movement of peoples cause environmental and linguistic effects. The expansion and intensification of long-distance trade routes often depended on environmental knowledge and technological adaptations. So the illustrative example would be the monsoon winds, right? Definitely understanding wind, tide, currents. You're going to go to school for that, like Prince Henry's Navigation School. At least, that's in Unit 4. But these sailors are going to be better trained, that's for sure. The Vikings, don't forget the Vikings, right? Their long ships were important. Those ships allowed them to, 1 minute travel on a river and then the next minute travel on an ocean. The Vikings were very effective traders, right? Going all the way to North America. Maybe not colonizing, but definitely traveling very far, right? The long ship. But that's a good one to remember in terms of, effective exploration, new technology. Arab traders adapted camels, right? The camels were very effective. They could store water. They could travel across and around the Sahara. And, the Mongols, or those pastoral groups, like the Xiongnu nomads, would use horses. Eventually, they would, improve the stirrup or the saddle. But horses and camels. All right, next sub-concept. Some migrations had significant environmental impact, including the migration of Bantu-speaking people who facilitated, and this is important, the transmission of iron technologies and agricultural techniques. So this concept wants you to explain, the impact of the Bantu migrations. And if you recall, the Bantu people were living in modern-day Nigeria, and they migrated to Eastern Africa and South Africa around 3000 BCE. And what did they bring? Well, their knowledge and ability to make iron tools, right? They built canoes. And this expertise in metallurgy really helped them, especially when it came to farming. And those technologies are going to spread not only to Africa, but all over the region with the Indian Ocean trade. They also brought disease, don't forget that. And remember bananas? The Bantu people spread their understanding, or brought their understanding of growing bananas. And that's important because bananas were a very effective crop, right? In terms of growing and maintaining. So we give the Bantus credit for the development and use of the banana and metallurgy, right? Spreading iron-making technology. All right, next sub-concept. Some migrations in commercial context led to the diffusion of language throughout the region and the emergence of new language. So that goes back to the Bantus, right? Bantu migrations led to the development of Swahili. So Bantu language melded with Arabic vocabulary. Remember, Eastern Africa was, the cities in Eastern Africa, like Mogadishu, which is Somalia today, were the home of many Arab merchant traders. So in that region, you're going to have the combination or the synthesis of the local Bantu languages and then obviously Arabic, which is going to develop into Swahili. The people of that region would be referred to as Swahili people as well. Right? That's the region. Don't forget also in the Abbasid Empire, right? So as the Abbasid, Arabic Empire expanded, they also took over Persia. People of Persia didn't speak Arabic; they spoke, Persian. And so in that region, you're going to see, Arabic spoken more often, and both actually, right? Persian is going to also spread into the Middle East. So why? Because when you can speak multiple languages, that helps you as a trader. It would help govern those different regions if you know multiple languages. So Arabic and Persian. Arabic extends into the Persian empires, and obviously Persian languages spread into the Middle Eastern areas. All right, next subconcept. Cross-cultural exchanges were fostered by the intensification of existing or the creation of new networks of trade and communication. The subconcept to that is that Islam, based on revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, developed in the Arabian Peninsula. The beliefs and practices of Islam reflected interactions among Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians with the local Arabian peoples. Muslim rule expanded to many parts of Afro-Eurasia due to military expansion, and Islam subsequently expanded through the activities of merchants and missionaries. So what do you want to focus on? Islam, right? Not only the religion, but also how the Islamic empires developed. So definitely test questions would assess your understanding of one, how Islam did emerge out of Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, right? Persian religion. And we do know that why did Muslim rule grow? Because of military expansion and missionary and merchant activity. So those are the big pieces that you'd be tested on. All right, so what do you want to remember about Islam? Remember, Muhammad founds Islam in 622 or around 622 CE, right? 600 years after the birth of Christ. He did honor Abraham, right? The Jewish, the Hebrew founder, and other prophets like Jesus. He did respect Christianity, and that's important. They believed in salvation and afterlife, and remember, they believed in submission to Allah. The Quran was their sacred book, and that the Quran obviously incorporated the 5 pillars, right? Your duties, praying, giving alms, fasting, and don't forget that pilgrimage, right? That pilgrimage was very important. That's going to facilitate trade, right? Remember, Mansa Musa travels to Mecca as part of the 5 pillar, and along the way, he gives out that gold, and he kind of, wakes up the world to the wealth and the accomplishments of those sub-Saharan empires. What else? Sharia law, right? That's important. Laws unify. Sharia law, again, it's more similar to the 10 Commandments, outlining rules and behavior for life, right? Not necessarily, local laws or, laws for criminal behavior. Polygamy was legalized. That's important, right? We talked about why that was established, right? Especially, as Islamic commanders were killed, multiple wives would be able to help one another when that husband was killed. They were encouraged not to enslave Jews or Christians or Muslims, and we know that Islam during this time was very tolerant of other religions. Remember the 2 different types of Muslim peoples or regions. You have Sunni Muslims who believe that the Caliph Abu Bakr was the next Caliph after Muhammad. He was the father-in-law. 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni, and that's important. Shia is the other group, obviously 10% of the Muslim world. They believed that Ali was the first true caliph, and Ali was Muhammad's cousin. So, again, Sunnis and Shias, at the core of it, they just have disagreements on who the next caliph was. Remember, Dar al-Islam would be the entirety of Islam, Sunnis and Shia. So if you see Dar al-Islam, it's just referring to the entirety of the Islamic or Muslim world. A caliph is the head of state. Obviously, Muslim governments were theocratic, right? The caliph not only guided the religious aspects of the empire, but he was the head of state. He was the governor. Islamic rulers could not withdraw support for Islam. They were, religious leaders. They claimed a relationship with Muhammad. That's important, right? At least through his uncle. And even when kings emerged in some of these regions, the caliphs were still very powerful and influential. All right, so how did Islam spread? Obviously, there were a number of factors. Drought and trade in Arabia pushed missionaries and merchants out to seek, a better place. Military conquest obviously was important, and tolerance, right? I think that by promoting tolerance, Islamic leaders believed that maybe people would find Islam attractive. Sometimes you might convert because you didn't want to pay that tax, right? We studied that in some of those primary sources. So you definitely want to be able to articulate, how and why Islam spread over time. And obviously there's trade, right? Merchants, and I would probably argue that's the most important piece, right? Traders not only brought goods with them, but also brought the Quran with them and helped convert people as far as, Africa and Southeast Asia, right? All right, I think it's important to remember the extent of Islam, right? Islam spread as far west as Spain. The city of Cordoba became the center of Islamic learning. This is where, the achievements of the Muslims, the writings of the Muslims, the translations of Greek and Roman texts were able to then travel to France or Germany, right? Spain is right there. You might see an image of the mosque in Cordoba, right? A beautiful architecture. So, what is that evidence of? The spread of Islam, right? The spread of Islam and their architecture, for example. Also don't forget the Arabic was brought to Persia under the Abbasid expansion. And then, obviously the Persian languages were then transmitted to the Arabian regions. All right, what are the main achievements? There's so many, but I always focus on the translation movement, right? Islamic historians translated Greek and Roman and Persian writings and thoughts into Arabic, whether it was about medicine or astronomy. And again, those translations made their way to Europe, for example, or other parts of the world. The Islamic doctors were some of the best. They had to obtain licenses and take exams, and that's important to remember. Geography, they were known for the creation of the astrolabe. They kind of utilized it for prayer so they could know where to pray or what direction to pray in. They were great mathematicians. Remember Al-Khwarizmi? He is the founder of the decimal system and algebra. And engineering, they developed the reservoir and more advanced wells. And obviously their architecture is quite impressive, right? The columns, I forget what these are called, right? So architecture and engineering in Cordoba. All right, next sub-concept. In key places along important trade routes, merchants set up diaspora communities where they introduce their own cultural traditions and into the indigenous culture. So you want to be able to identify diaspora communities, migrant communities, right? Whether it was Jews or Muslims, right? These, merchants or missionaries traveled to or moved to far-off places, and small communities developed. So Jews will be found living, remember, Hebrews originate in Israel right here. And as time would go on, mostly because of persecution, they would move. So by, the early 1400s, you're going to find Jews living in Spain, Russia, Egypt, Thailand, Southeast Asia, which is Thailand, even China. The travel journals of Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo both mention Jewish merchant communities in China. Muslim merchants are going to be living in Calicut, which is near India. Obviously, Malaysia. If you go to Indonesia today, you're going to see mosques and Islam all over the place. So these are examples of diaspora communities. Very important term to remember. And again, be able to provide examples of those diaspora communities and what those communities established, right? New religions, new customs, new ways, new cultures, architecture, engineering, all those things were brought to those new places. All right, next concept, as exchange networks intensified, an increased number of travelers within Afro-Eurasia wrote about their travels. Their writings illustrate both the extent and the limitations of intercultural knowledge and understanding. Also, don't forget, Afro-Eurasia would refer to Africa, Europe, and Asia. That entire region is known as Afro-Eurasia. And that's a very large region, obviously. So what do you want to be able to identify? The writers, the travelers, like Ibn Battuta, right? He's going to travel from Morocco into Africa and the Middle East. He is going to, describe the wealth of Africa, of Mali. He's going to be writing about the different Islamic customs, especially in terms of the role of women in Africa. So he's always very important. Zhuan Zhang, he's a Buddhist monk who left China to go to India. He studies in Indian monasteries or Buddhist Indian monasteries and brings back Buddhism. So we're going to give him credit for transferring Buddhism to China, or at least, some of the credit. Zhuan Zhang. There he is. Peter Abelrod and Heloise, remember those two? They wrote, they traveled all over Europe. They wrote about, the changes occurring in Europe. Enan was a Buddhist monk who educated the Japanese about the Tang government. And Marco Polo and William Rubric, Europeans who were deep into Mongol culture. Rubric attempted to spread Christianity into Asia. So, who would I remember? Definitely Ibn Battuta, Zhuan Zhang, probably Enan and William Rubric, just because they're spreading religion, right? Not only are they writing, but they're spreading, their religions. Increased cross-cultural interactions resulted in the diffusion of literary, artistic, and cultural traditions, as well as scientific and technological innovations. What do you want to elaborate on? Those transfers, right? Whether it's religion or other aspects of culture. Remember, Neo-Confucianism spreads into Japan and Korea, right? From China, where it combines aspects of Buddhism. Zen Buddhism obviously emerges in China and Vietnam and Japan, and it kind of combines Taoism with Buddhism, right? The spread of Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism into Southeast Asia. Remember, Southeast Asia would be Malaysia, Thailand. I would probably say Vietnam, Indonesia, where Bali is today, those beautiful islands of Bali where I'd love to go surf someday. The spread of Islam made its way into Africa. And Christianity, we're going to see Christianity emerge in Ethiopia or the city of Axum, right? There's that famous Christian church. Obviously, Greek and Indian mathematics, Muslim scholars adopted or learned from Indian and Greek mathematicians. So we do kind of want to give the Indian mathematicians a little credit for influencing, those Arabic mathematicians. Greek science and philosophy made its way to Western Europe, right? So those Greek and Roman ideas were translated by Arab scholars, and through Cordoba, they found their way into Europe, right? So the translation movement was very important to spurring on the Renaissance. And paper making, iron plows, the horse collar, printing, gunpowder all came from China into Arabic or Islamic empires and eventually Western Europe. And remember, the Mongols facilitated that, right? They're going to also adopt those military techniques, especially. And those techniques are going to be adopted then by the Europeans, right? You might see this. This is Qutb Minar. This is a famous Hindu building in Southeast Asia. So you're going to see kind of the combination or the combining of Islamic. Here's your little mosque with Hindu architecture. Again, I believe this is Southeast Asia. Either Malaysia or I'm not really sure where. I'd have to go back and remember, but just this is definitely a diffusion of at least architecture and religion. Angkor Thom is in Cambodia, Hindu art and sculptures, but it's a Buddhist temple as well. So you're going to see Hinduism and Buddhism kind of combined, at least in terms of what you're going to see there, right? So you're going to have Hindu art, sculptures, and architecture combining with Buddhist sculptures in Angkor Thom. The spread of Islamic architecture to Europe, traders bringing math texts from India. I think we just mentioned that earlier. And again, the translation movement. So don't forget, those are great examples of cultural and scientific diffusion. All right, Islam in India. So remember, Islam eventually makes its way to India. It made its way to India forcefully and peacefully. Mahmud of Ganzai destroyed Buddhist and Hindu shrines, trying to force converts, but mostly, right, Islam was adopted voluntarily. And a lot of it was through marriage, right, through traders. Muslim traders would marry into non-Muslim Southeast Asian families. It appealed to low-caste Hindus, right, like Christianity did to poor Christians, like Buddhism did to poor Indians or Indians on the lower castes. Buddhism became a minority religion in India. Obviously, that was the irony. Hinduism eventually took over, and Islam as well. A lot of it had to do with corruption. Buddhist monks did engage in some corruption. Buddhists in India were the largest groups of converts to Islam, so they didn't necessarily convert to Hinduism. Most of them converted to Islam. The Sufis. Remember the Sufis? The Sufis are a mystical group of Islamic believers. They weren't as structured or as loyal to Sharia law, especially. They weren't Sunni or Shia. They did believe in, obviously, the five pillars and Muhammad as a prophet, but they didn't necessarily believe in some of the minutiae, the strict doctrines, right? And they're going to convert a lot of Buddhists to Islam in India, and that's important. So the Sufis played a big role in the growth of Islam in India, at least. As a result of Sufi influence, Hinduism did begin to focus more on a personal devotion to a single god, right? Not just to the, ending the cycle, but also devotion to a single god. And there were, Hinduism was polytheistic, but that's going to change a bit or transform into, I wouldn't say a monotheistic religion, but one of those gods might become more important to certain people. All right, next key concept, we're almost done. There were continued diffusion of crops and pathogens, including epidemic diseases like the bubonic plague. So definitely be able to explain the basics of the plague and also how it was established and the impact. I think the impact is very important. And as population declined, there weren't a lot of workers, remember? So basically peasants kind of were able to, ask for wages, supply and demand. And I think that's important, and that's going to contribute to the end of the feudal system, right? Workers are going to basically say, hey, you got to pay me if you want me, and that's important. It's kind of the beginnings of capitalism in a sense. All right, that's it. Next lecture is on 3.2. I'm going to do that next, so go back and kind of review 3.1.